Somewhere beneath the ocean, according to one of history's most respected philosophers, lies a civilization more advanced than anything that existed in the ancient world. A civilization with a navy of 10,000 ships, with architecture so precise that its builder recorded the exact height of every structure, with agricultural systems so sophisticated they harvested crops twice a year, with a city so beautiful, so ordered, so powerful, that when it vanished, it took the memory of an entire era with it. We are talking about Atlantis. And before you assume this is another conspiracy video, stay with me, because the story of Atlantis is not what most people think it is. It is older, stranger, and far more interesting than any documentary has ever told you. Every story about Atlantis leads back to one man. Not a conspiracy theorist, not a mystic, not a tabloid writer. Plato, one of the most influential philosophers in the history of Western thought. A man whose ideas about politics, reality, and human nature are still taught in universities across the world today. A man whose intellectual credibility is, by any standard, extraordinary. Around 360 BC, Plato wrote two texts, the Timaeus and the Critias. In them, he described a civilization that existed approximately 9,000 years before his own time. That places Atlantis at roughly 9,500 BC, and what he described was not vague. It was not poetic. It was architectural. It was precise. Plato described a city built in concentric rings, alternating circles of land and water, all connected by canals wide enough for ships to pass through. At the center stood a magnificent temple to Poseidon, decorated with gold statues. The island itself, he said, was larger than Libya and Asia combined. It commanded a fleet of 10,000 vessels. Its army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its soil was so fertile, its irrigation so advanced, that farmers harvested twice every year. He gave numbers, heights, widths, depths, areas. You do not invent a myth with engineering specifications. Or at least, if you do, you are doing something far more deliberate than simple storytelling. So where was Atlantis? Plato is clear. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the rock formations flanking the Strait of Gibraltar, the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. And then, in a single day and a single night, it sank beneath the waves. Here is where most Atlantis documentaries go wrong. They leap from Plato's description straight to submarines and alien technology and crystal energy. And in doing so, they destroy the genuine mystery hiding inside the story. Let's stay with the evidence. Around 9,500 BC, something real was happening to the world. The last ice age was ending. Global temperatures were rising. Ice sheets that had covered enormous portions of the northern hemisphere were melting. And as they melted, sea levels were rising. Not by inches, but by hundreds of feet over the course of thousands of years. Coastlines that had been inhabited for generations were swallowed by the ocean. Land bridges disappeared. Islands that had once been mountains attached to continents became isolated peaks surrounded by water. This was not mythology. This was geology. It happened. And it happened during exactly the period Plato describes. The question is not whether civilizations were disrupted by rising seas, and they were. The question is whether any of those disrupted civilizations was sophisticated enough to match what Plato wrote. And here, the science becomes genuinely interesting. Because we keep finding things that shouldn't be there. This is the part that changes everything. Plato was not primarily a historian. He was a philosopher. And throughout his work, he used invented stories, myths, allegories, thought experiments to illustrate philosophical ideas. His most famous work, The Republic, contains a vision of an ideal state. It also contains the story of a soldier who dies, visits the afterlife, and is reincarnated. Did Plato believe that literally happened? Almost certainly not. It was a device, a way of making an idea vivid. Aristotle, who studied under Plato for 20 years and knew him better than almost anyone, did not believe Atlantis was real. He thought Plato had invented it to make a point. And what point? Read carefully, and Atlantis begins to look like a warning. A story about a civilization that became too powerful, too proud, too disconnected from its own values. A civilization that forgot what made it great and was destroyed. Not by accident, but as a consequence. Plato was writing during a period when Athens itself had recently suffered catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War, when Athenian democracy was under pressure, when the question of what causes great civilizations to collapse was not academic. It was urgent. It was personal. Atlantis may have been his answer, a mirror held up to his own world, and yet something nags, because scattered across the ancient world in cultures that had no contact with each other, we find the same story. A great flood, a civilization destroyed, survivors who carried the memory forward in Mesopotamia, in India, in the Americas, in the Pacific Islands. These stories are not identical. They are not copied from one another. They emerged independently across thousands of miles of ocean and land from peoples who could not have communicated. What if they are all remembering the same thing? Not Atlantis specifically, not a single island with rings and temples, but the same global catastrophe. The end of the Ice Age, the rising of the seas, the drowning of the world that people had known, that left its mark on every culture that lived through it. The memory of that catastrophe may have survived, not in documents, not in stone carvings, but in stories, in the oldest and most persistent form of human communication, in the thing that gets passed from grandmother to grandchild, around a fire, across thousands of years, until it eventually reaches a Greek philosopher who writes it down and calls it Atlantis. So what is Atlantis? It is probably not a single lost island waiting to be discovered beneath the Atlantic Ocean. It is probably not the origin of pyramid-building technology or the home of a master race. It is probably not buried under Antarctica or hidden in the Bahamas. But it is also not nothing. It may be the echo of a real catastrophe, the greatest environmental transformation in human prehistory, preserved in story form across 10,000 years. It may be a philosophical parable built on genuine historical memory. It may be a warning that the most advanced civilizations are not immune to collapse. That power, without wisdom, destroys itself. That the ocean does not care how sophisticated your navy is. 2,500 years after Plato wrote it down, we are still searching for Atlantis. Maybe because we recognize something in the story, something about the fragility of the world we have built, something about what happens when a civilization forgets what it was built on. Maybe Atlantis is not something we need to find. Maybe it is something we need to understand.